Wow. Roger Ackroyd. I think, Chad, this has been one of the hardest books to talk about without Spoiler Town USA. I'm proud of us in our pre-read. I think we did a pretty good job.
I agree. I agree completely.
You have a suggestion for listeners and like specific types of listeners. And I think we should just give that suggestion and then go into the like who, what, how right away so we can be as frank with each other as possible, which is always what I'm aiming for.
Exactly. And not just about the book.
Yeah. In all subjects.
Chad, that smock you wore the other day was terrible. Okay. So this is the thing with this. Normally, the way that we do these debriefs is that we give away the murderer and the victim right up at the top. And we say like, oh my gosh, if you haven't read the book yet, stop now. And that holds true for this book too. If you haven't read it yet and you want to read it without any spoilers, stop now.
Yeah.
But also, because of the nature of the book, if you've only read it once and you're thinking about maybe reading it again, you might want to listen to this episode after you've read it a second time.
That's really true.
Because there's so many different things that you see the second time through. So that's just what we'll say. I think that sums it up pretty well.
Yeah. No, I was just like, everyone like pause and just like think about your future. Think about your choices and how you want to experience this book. And then we trust you to make the best decision for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we...
I have so many things to say after we give it all away. So let's just do that right now. Victim, no surprise, right? It's in the title.
Yeah, the victim is Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah. It would be surprising if it wasn't him.
Yeah, if that was the big twist, is that that it was just a typo.
He's fine.
And then I'm going to go ahead and ask you the question, Caitlin, but who is the murderer?
Oh my gosh. So it is our buddy, our pal, the Hastings replacement, Dr. Shepard. The narrator we've been trusting the whole time has been fooling us. Chad, do you remember the first time you read it? Did you pick up on that it was Dr. Shepard?
I was completely stymied almost until the very end of the book. How about yourself?
Well, here's the thing is I am pretty fast and loose with all of my guesses. So like during the course of reading a book, I have suspected everyone. So like there were definitely points, and this was I've read this book a lot of times by now, but I think the first time I read it, I remember being like, could it be the doctor? But then going, no, it can't be. But I don't think we should really put much into that because I just kind of play around with everybody as a possible suspect. It's interesting because Agatha Christie can't really redo this, at least in the Poirot series. She does have other books, and I won't tell you which one. You meaning like the universal you listeners, which one, because I don't want to spoil it. But she does do this at least one other time where she's like, surprised it was me.
The concept of getting away with it once is amazing. To try it again would be breathtaking.
And to be successful at it. Mm-hmm. I think that the one that she did was like several decades later. So I think like she had lulled us into a sense of comfort, and also like what are the chances that her readers are like reading this one and the other one. So I think she safely was successful with that. Okay, I'm gonna make an analogy. It's kind of like if you're drinking some whiskey or something, and then like a really good one, and then you add like a drop of water. Like, you know, the ones where it's like if you're really careful with like how much you put into it, and then the flavor just like blossoms. Or like a glass of wine, it's sitting for an hour or two as you're like going about your meal, and it just gets like more and more complex and more enjoyable. it's like this with like the first and the second read, that like the book is good, like you were saying, the first time you read it, and then you reread it and suddenly there's just this like so much texture and so much complexity going on.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And it's so exciting. And I really got excited even this time, because it had been a couple years, reading this for the pre-read and then rereading it for the debrief. The second experience was just so much more fun. And it's really changed. Like, I'll say this up front, and I wrote this in a lot of different places in my notes, but like, it's really changed my idea about like what makes a mystery good. And I think this is something that Agatha Christie does really well. And it hadn't really hit me in this way. To make a really successful mystery, you have to be writing it for the second read in mind. And you have to have these like double meanings or these moments. Every moment can be read in two different ways. And the reader should be able to track all the ways that you've been telling them the entire time who it is.
I want to just say that I'm glad you did the whiskey wine analogy, because if I would have done it, it would have been like, you know how like when you make a really great vegan soup and then it tastes good the first day, but the second day it just blooms. Okay. It tastes so much better. And that's just annoying. No one wants to hear that.
But it's true.
That is true. It is true.
Yeah. Day 2.
The thing about this book is that Agatha Christie's writing, even in the previous 2 books to this one, Styles and the golf one, Lynx.
The golf one. I love, this is a sign that you've healed, Chad.
I think so. I think that's a good
sign. You can't really remember its name.
Right.
I think we're in a good place.
I was like, it's gone. Chad, it's gone, finally. But you can tell, even though those are remarkably different books than this one, you can tell it's the same writer. And what I think she's done here is she's created something that fits perfectly for her style of writing. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to have this like stripped down sort of storytelling where we go off into these different little tangents and things like that. But the fact that the narrator is the murderer, you can't write this book in a really complicated way, because that in and of itself is so deeply complicated, that concept, that it's like, she just like, if it would have been written in the style of, say, Lynx or Styles, it would not have worked. Your head would have exploded.
It's all about deception. And that's the thing that's complicated. And that's really, I think, this feels like I think we've said like in every book, we're like, this is a turning point for her. She's doing something new here. And I'm curious to find out when we're like, no, this is pretty standard. There's no turning point. Because I think the Big Four next will also be a turning point for like sadder reasons. Not sadder, just like more disappointing reasons. It feels like she is comfortable with getting to the point in here in a way that it felt like the other ones. We talked about this like glut of information, this like glut of plot. There's this like confidence here. I want to call it elegant, but it is darkly elegant.
Yeah.
Like, there is something that like gives you chills when you reread it and you understand what's actually going on. It's just sinister.
I just kept saying, like, that is vicious. That is absolutely vicious.
I love that word for it.
Because this person is in your head and you're trusting them. And the second time through, you're like, oh, what a terrible that is vicious.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's just, oh, yeah, it's so good.
That is such a good word. And there are so many, like, I didn't even realize at the time the level of coldness. He is a predator.
Yeah.
Like, the way that people are trusting him. And it's actually like, there were a couple times that it made me really sad for these people who trusted him so much. And these people who are just like good people, like trying to get by. And they confide in him. And that ends up being their biggest like fatal mistake, is trusting this man who you are supposed to trust because he's a healer, which I think is like something that, as you said too, is so vicious. He is in a position of safety. Mm-hmm. And even in so many mysteries too, it's always like, somebody's been murdered, bring in the doctor.
Yep.
And the doctor's the side character. Like, the doctor never really plays into it. It's like, this is this outside force that's going to give us some clues, and that's it.
Right. And given that, especially in the Styles, the doctor was a very important character.
Right. I kind of forgot about that. Maybe that changes what I just said.
Well, no, I meant it in the sense that, like, she's clearly playing with the thing that she has created to a certain extent.
I'm glad we're just kind of talking about big picture thoughts we're having. And then as we go through the chapters, we can kind of pick out the parts that represent kind of these things that we're observing.
Yes.
But a lot of this too is she's playing with the sense of trust that she's created with us too. She knows when we as a reader will trust her because of what she set up in her first 2 books. And she is also kind of betraying us in a way that's fine. It's like, we're okay with that. But this is like a betrayal of the reader's trust, I would say, to a big degree.
I did read that some people who read this book were not thrilled with it because of that. They felt betrayed by the ending and that it was like a cheat rather than a brilliant piece of writing. I disagree with that completely. So
I think almost like a big reaction like that, like feeling such a sense of betrayal, is maybe a sign that it's working.
Yep.
But then again, too, like, here's the difference for me. Like, looking at a story and seeing if the ending lands and if the ending feels earned. And I think if this plot twist were to come out of nowhere, and if she hadn't been telling us the entire time, and literally from like the first page, something is wrong and we have no idea because of the way she's written it. If there had been no indication it was him, I think that is a justifiable sense of being
betrayed.
Like, I hate it when I feel like a book thinks I'm kind of dumb and I'll accept anything, you know?
Right.
They're like, you'll buy this, right? This is fine. And it's like, no, trust me, like, I'm smarter than this. Please don't pander to me. And I feel like this book is setting the bar pretty high for the reader to actually intuit and like figure out what's going on. You can, but like most times we fail, and that's exciting. But if there had just been 0 clues, 0 hints, then it would be like, what are we doing here? You just didn't know how to end this.
Right. All the information is in this book. You just have to be either super onto it the first time you read it, or you have to either know what happens or read it again. And then you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, that's right.
That's such a good point. And I'm thinking of like some specific examples in mind, but I won't name them. But like, there's a feeling of, if you're going to go through red herrings too, please don't waste my time.
Yeah.
You know, because like if we go through all these red herrings and they don't add anything to the plot, they don't add anything to the mystery, I do feel as if someone was just trying to take advantage of me.
Yeah, I felt that way about the first 2 books a little bit. There were certain red herrings and dead ends that I was like, why is that in there? Now looking back at it, like, I don't, but everything here makes sense as a red herring because the guy who's writing the book is trying to get you and Poirot off the case. There's like a personal part of it.
He's invested in like obscuring the truth every step of the way.
I feel like we should potentially dive into this.
We should, or else we had set a goal for ourselves to get through a couple chapters, and at this rate, we'll get through like 2, which is okay. We've decided to not try to rush through it. This isn't giving us a surprise like Lynx at how long it's going to be, but we just wanted to let ourselves like get to linger in all of the great moments rather than trying to like rush through it. So that's where we are.
The way that I thought the debriefs went, the 1,000 debrief episodes we did for Lynx, ended up being, it was like therapy after I had been at like a weekend-long family reunion that was very difficult. Right?
That's a really good way to describe it.
This is more like therapy after I've seen something amazing.
Yeah.
I just want to talk about it in the sense of like, there's so much to go over. So I think it's important that we take our time with it and that we just let ourselves do whatever we're going to do.
Okay, let's dive in. So, yeah, you're going to give chapter overviews and then we'll kind of get into the weeds of each one. So, Dr. Shepherd at the breakfast table, chapter 1. Tell us what happens.
Here's a brief summary. Our narrator, Dr. James Shepherd, returns home after being called to examine the corpse of Mrs. Ferrars, a local woman who is overdosed on Veronal, a medication prescribed to help her sleep. Once home, Dr. Shepherd discusses the death of Mrs. Ferrars with his sister Caroline, whom he lives with. Caroline believes that Mrs. Ferrars intentionally overdosed on Veronal because of the guilt she felt about murdering her husband, Ashley Ferrars, by poisoning him and making it look like death by gastritis.
I am so glad you have the job of summarizing. And I'm glad that I have the job of being like, no, let's talk about every detail. That was great.
Yes. Well,
that was so good.
Oh, thank you.
And I think like your version is exactly what that first time reader would experience. But indulge me in slowing down a little bit. This first scene, we have Dr. Shepherd coming home. As you said, like after tending to Mrs. Ferrars in her death. And what we don't know at the time is he is totally freaked out. I would almost call this whole book lying by omission, where he's leaving things out to the point that I almost started visualizing it as a blackout poem or like a letter that's been redacted.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So let's just play around with these first few sentences. I'll read the first sentence, then I'll skip down. Mrs. Ferrars died on the night of the 16th to 17th of September, a Thursday, which is such a like the top of the form that we're filling out, you know? It's not even because like Hastings is always like, here's how this big journey helped me realize this thing. And now I look back on it with fondness or, you know, like it's always this big grand, like this changed my life. Get ready for it.
Right. Yeah. Hastings would have been like Mrs. Ferrars, a woman who I had a crush on for at least 5 weeks. Yeah. But, you know, like just this, like it would have been about him and the tragedy of it affecting his life.
Yeah. And it's so stark too, because like Hastings would make it all about himself. And in this one, Dr. Shepherd, he even says, you know, I was called for at 8:00. There was nothing to be done. Even that like passive voice, which he does a lot, by saying there was, he's removing himself as like a subject. So he goes inside and then we get this moment that's so weird when you think about it. He says, I opened the door with my latchkey and purposely delayed a few moments in the hall. And so we can kind of think later when he introduces Caroline that he is preparing himself to like not tell Caroline that Mrs. Ferrars killed herself.
I think he's also at this point in time being like, because later on we find out that he was concerned that she would write a letter to Ackroyd. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's also going through his mind here.
Yeah, so I think that's the actual thing that's happening, but we can justify this weird behavior, like on a first read, by being like, oh, okay, he just wants to prepare himself to deal with Caroline. But really, he's totally freaked out. And he says, to tell the truth, I was considerably upset and worried. I'm not going to pretend that at that moment, I foresaw the events of the next few weeks. I emphatically did not so, but my instinct told me that there were stirring times ahead. This is the most like reserved, close to the chest way of saying that he's terrified. Everything that he's been building up has just fallen apart.
And I think because we're used to the narrator being Hastings, we take those words to mean he had an inkling that we were going on an adventure together, as opposed to being like, oh, I might have to kill this guy.
Yeah. Hastings does always say, like, this was a moment that really changed my life forever. But again, it's always about, like, his love life or, like, who his roommate is.
Right. Or, like, one of his friends' wife who he's deeply attracted to.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about, like, him. Whereas in this, it's like, oh, no, I'm about to have to cover up something. Gosh, this is so clever because we meet Caroline And we get this like really charming exchange between Dr. Shepard and Caroline, his sister. She's so intelligent. Their exchanges with each other and their impressions of each other are kind of silly. You know, like it's charming.
Mm-hmm.
He is always like, oh, she's so curious about like what's going on in the town. Like she always assumes that she knows what's going on. What a fun little bit of banter we're setting up. That also puts us at ease. It's like, oh, okay, I know what's going on. Everything's fine. Look at this charming brother and sister.
I'm guessing that Agatha Christie is heightening it to a certain extent, but from my standpoint as an ugly American, it's just like how charmingly British this is. This is just this dialogue, this back and forth. We immediately know their relationship. I could see all of the British sitcoms that I used to watch from the 70s and 80s. The banter, the back and forth, the comfort. I can see what their home looks like. It's so perfectly written. And also, it does throw you off the concept that Dr. Shepard could be anything but this very decent fellow.
You know, we've had these like charming little moments of observational humor before with Agatha Christie, but in here she really shines. There are these moments that are funny and, as you said, like very British in the way that it shows like the worldview of the characters and what they judge as good and bad and like good behavior, bad behavior. It's just so comforting. Here she's showing off like, look at how funny and smart I am, but as a way to like totally get us to forget about and excuse all the weird shit that Dr. Shepard's just done.
It's really great writing, I think, to be able to create these memorable characters and then throw you off the scent of one of them.
I was thinking about like, why is Caroline here? What is her role? Because she really doesn't. She sent like later on, she sent on this like mission about some boots, but like really that's really her only role because she's always at home. She like he says this right away. She's at home. She gets all of her information because she has this intelligence core of servants and tradesmen that are going to everyone's house. And so she just befriends them. She's like befriending the milkman and she's like, so any hot goss on your rounds? And so that's like how she knows everything. So she's always at home. And I was just like, what really is her role? And I think it is to disarm. We normalize that he hides things from her because he says, you know, like, all these people in the town are confiding in me. I have access to all this knowledge as a doctor that no one else has. And so I don't tell Caroline, but I know she's going to figure it out anyways. But when she does figure it out, then it's not my fault that I told her. He says she usually finds out just the same, but I have the moral satisfaction of knowing that I'm in no way to blame. So he sets up right away, it's normal that I lie. But it's almost like I'm doing it to preserve the privacy of my patients. Like there's this like, he's like, I lie, but it's noble. This gives us such an easy reason for us to be like, okay, well, yeah, he's not telling her all the truth, but it's okay. It's what he does.
I think that there is a comfort and a regularity to their existence that in a way allows him to do the things that he does. Because he knows that there's this much room to do all of these things and still come off as being proper and within the guidelines of their relationship as brother and sister. So as long as he doesn't do something that makes her suspicious, he knows that he'll have a place to come home to where he'll be fine. And that there's something to me so deeply like all of the different things in the world that can be scary, and there are so many of them. But one of the things that's scariest to me is the white dude who can get away with it because he just decides to start doing really horrible things. But because of his place in society, he's never suspected. Yeah. So it's just a great glimpse into how that would potentially go.
And people just like inherently trust him for like what his job is, what he looks like, what uniform he's in. And yeah, and it's like this carte blanche to just be as horrible as possible as you can be, and nobody, you're the last one to be suspected. The last thing that I want to like leave this chapter with is like whenever Caroline is getting close to the truth, she's like, she did kill her husband. He just is like, no. He dismisses her. He says, I told her firmly her whole idea was nonsense. I was all the more firm because I secretly agreed with some part, at least, of what she said. But it is all wrong that Caroline should arrive at the truth. by simply a kind of inspired guesswork. Again, he's giving us a reason why he doesn't want her to be right. He's like, I want to put her in her place. But then the thing that's so creepy about where we end this chapter, and again, it's that coldness. It's that, what was the word that you used, like, to describe
vicious?
Him? Vicious. Yeah. So, they're kind of talking about, like, did she kill herself? What do you think? She's asking him, like, are you totally satisfied that it was an accident? Yeah, she asks him, are you absolutely satisfied? And then the last sentence of this chapter is, I did not answer, but got up from the table.
Right.
Which is like, I think it's so easy on the first read to just brush over things like that. But then we're like, wait, he's not telling her, he's not telling us. He just exits, which is kind of his whole strategy, right. Is just like, not deny, but to just say nothing. That's where like that coldness comes in. It's kind of unfeeling. He just doesn't say anything at all. Oh, it's just so creepy. It's just like, this is the thing that gives me shivers. I think it's a deceptively, well, it's sinister, but it's deceptively pleasant start and kind of innocuous start to the book.
Utterly pleasant. Chapter 1, the first read through. Totally different than the other two books, which, as we've said before now, were all about Hastings and, oh my God, and this and this and this. Yeah. And this is just this guy having this lovely relationship with his sister.
Yeah.
After, checking out a dead body, which it's a mystery. So we're used to that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, yeah, it's charming. And then the charm gets like, the volume gets turned up on that because the next chapter is like gossip central. It's called Who's Who in King's Abbot. King's Abbot is a town. I don't think we mentioned that in the pre-read, but it's kind of just like an update on all the gossip. So Chad, take us through chapter 2.
Dr. Shepard describes the small village of King's Abbot while mulling over Caroline's theories concerning the Ferrars. He bumps into Roger Ackroyd, the owner of the largest estate in King's Abbot. Ackroyd is distressed over the death of Mrs. Ferrars as they were seemingly quite close. Roger Ackroyd invites Dr. Shepard to dinner that night at 7:30 p.m. to discuss the matter.
Again, gorgeously succinct. So let's talk about it. Let's get into the details. I love the way that the King's Abbot village is described. We won't go through it all, but this is where we get that kind of like cheek and that observational humor. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to read the last sentence of her description. It's a place where able-bodied men are apt to leave the place early in life, but we are rich in unmarried ladies and retired military officers. Our hobbies and recreations can be summed up in one word: gossip. So it almost gives like a Jane Austen kind of vibe. And then we get the like most important families. We get Fernley Park, which belongs to Ackroyd, and King's Paddock, which belongs to the Ferrars. And we get this really nice idea of like who Ackroyd is. And, he kind of describes him as like kind of like a country squire would be in like old stories. Mm-hmm. But essentially he's like involved in everything. He's involved in clubs and cricket. And he's actually described as, quote, the life and soul of our peaceful village. So this to me, on the second read, the murder is even more egregious because not only is he murdering his friend, but he's literally murdering the life and soul of the village. Like the village's sweetheart, basically.
If we take Agatha Christie out of the equation, and if this is Dr. Shepard writing this, he could also like be using it as sort of a literary device as a way to make the death seem even more tragic. Yeah. That he was a part of, right? And so I mean, like that might be a stretch, but there is that feeling of it too, because he's the one writing this. Mm-hmm. So it's just like he's describing Roger Ackroyd, and we are taking his word for how important Roger Ackroyd is to the town.
And his like kind of maybe loving descriptions too is a nice way for us. It would be like, well, how could he kill this person? He's the life and soul of our village. He thinks that too. There's so much going on here. We get a quick rundown too of like the Ackroyd family. And I think it's worth talking about because it's actually kind of complicated. Yeah. In this part, I was just like, why are you doing this to us? So we also get as you had kind of hinted about in the last chapter, the breakdown of Ackroyd's past and Mrs. Ferrars' past. And so Ackroyd has a really tragic life. He was young. He was only 21. He fell in love with a beautiful older woman who was a widow and had a child named Ralph. Her last name was Patton. And they had a brief marriage, and it was very painful. And she was an alcoholic to the point that she died 4 years later, which is like very serious if she's only 25.
Yeah.
Or 26. So Ackroyd takes Ralph, the son, and raises him as his own. So like we feel for Ackroyd. He's had this horrible past, but he's like doing the honorable thing and like taking on Ralph. Ralph is like your classic male lead in any British story, I feel like. He's wild and worrisome. He's handsome. He's 25 years old. Everybody loves him. Everybody has a lot of affection towards him, but he's also kind of just irresponsible and all over the place. He's a lovable mess. Then we move to Mrs. Ferrars, who everybody kind of thinks Ackroyd is in love with. He has some actually like a couple potential ladies in his life, but all of the gossips are saying that Ackroyd and Mrs. Ferrars were in love. And so we get this, and you'd said this before, everyone kind of assumes, as you said, it's very progressive, that they'll like marry each other and like process through and heal from their experiences with alcoholic spouses. So Mrs. Ferrars also has this like tragic past, which is one of the things that also makes Dr. Shepherd so cold, is he has absolutely no reason to do any of this stuff to these people besides for his own gain. There's no values, that he's like committing these things for. He is preying on these vulnerable people.
I think if possible, we should leave the specific reason why he murders Ackroyd until the murder itself. Okay. If that's possible. Just like, because it's so interesting to like say all of this stuff about his motivation. And then when you realize what it is, you're like, oh, wow. That is sociopathic.
It's selfish.
That is incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. He is like the definition of the like white male sociopath, just like running rampant around the world, doesn't care about the consequences. Yeah, he's like a Wall Street banker.
Yep, but he's got that big old doctor's bag. So, yeah.
Oh, gosh. Okay. There were a lot of like all caps thoughts about the doctor's bag in my notes. Lastly, so we kind of need to sort out, there is this cast of characters that's kind of confusing. So we also have Miss Russell, who is Ackroyd's housekeeper. And so people had kind of said like, every housekeeper he had, the gossips were like, is he going to marry her?
Right.
And so Mrs. Russell is the most recent one. It sounds like she may have a crush on him. She's also very beautiful. And so it's like, it's either going to be Mrs. Ferrars or Mrs. Russell. And then in comes Mrs. Cecil Ackroyd, who is his sister-in-law, so his brother's wife. So they have the same last name. They are not of blood relation.
Correct.
But she's like bound to his family through marriage. So the Mr. and Mrs. Ackroyd can be kind of confusing. Mrs. Ackroyd, it sounds like she's there to like kind of take his money, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, I think she lives a life of comfort because of him.
Yeah, she's there because he can take care of her and provide for her, and she doesn't have to really do much. So she's kind of like, I wouldn't want to call her a leech, but she's just like one of the like, if you are really wealthy and you have a big family, you're going to end up supporting a handful of people.
Yeah.
And she's one of them. And so she also has a daughter named Flora. And there are these, I'm just going to say it like kind of ahead of time. There are these rumors that Flora and Ralph maybe are romantically connected. We're reminded a lot that they are of no blood relation.
Right. On paper, it would be a little funky, but like once you realize that there's no blood relation, it's still a little funky, but it's not terrible. Yeah.
It's definitely like the marry your cousin thing, except they're not blood related. So it's like one step better than Styles, where we were talking about marrying cousins and they were blood related. Yeah. So yeah. And so with Mrs. Ackroyd in the house, she apparently has, quote, put Mrs. Russell in her place, meaning that she's kind of like told Mrs. Russell, like, you're not going to marry Roger. Like, don't even think about it. Just do your job.
There's something that happens in this chapter while Dr. Shepherd is making his rounds and kind of going around town. He's reminiscing about, as he's thinking about Ralph, he's reminiscing about the time that he saw Ralph and Mrs. Ferrars talking together, seemingly, potentially, in his mind, arguing or talking about something. And he describes it in such a way, he says, I think I can safely say that it was at this moment that a foreboding of the future first swept over me. Nothing tangible as yet, but a vague premonition of the way things were setting. That earnest tete-a-tete between Ralph Peyton and Mrs. Ferrars the day before struck me disagreeably. And later on we find out what he thinks they may have been talking about, even though he's wrong.
Yeah, and he sees it as a threat to him, that they're talking together. And it's so interesting the way he sets it up. Like, just before we get the scene that, you know, Dr. Shepherd has seen these two people recently talking and maybe scheming. And it also sets us up that maybe Mrs. Ferrars or Ralph are, the way to read it on the surface is that they're having a big disagreement about, like, maybe inheritance or something like that.
Right.
Like, he might be like, stay away from my uncle, I want his money, that kind of thing. But he kind of sets up, so we have like all this like potential love, right? We have this love between Ackroyd and Mrs. Ferrars. We have this potential engagement with Ralph. So we're getting this like good, happy story. And now with Mrs. Ferrars' death, that's probably a suicide, he says this thing that's so interesting. Now there has been a rearrangement of the kaleidoscope. From a mild discussion of probable wedding presents, we had been jerked into the midst of a tragedy. And I think that's such a good way to describe, like, okay, this is what the town is feeling, the like weird shift of a kaleidoscope, but also it's kind of like the way that we're looking at the story. You can also think about it a bit of a kaleidoscope. You just turn it a little bit and all the pictures change. So I thought that was really great that she gives us this. Again, she's like telling us exactly what's happening, but we are just not picking up on it. So, okay, so we get that kaleidoscope shift. And so maybe that's when he's starting to look at, like, how do I get myself out of this? If the worst happens, if I am going to be exposed for things that we'll discuss later, what's my escape plan?
Right.
What's my plan? And I think this observing Ralph and Mrs. Ferrars, it scares him. But also, I think it plants in his mind that he could take advantage of the gossip that's already surrounding these people and really narrate the situation in a way that takes the blame away from him and puts it on these already present assumptions about everyone's motivations and their relationships with each other.
Wow.
So, this moment that he sees Ralph is also a little weird because everyone thinks that Ralph is in London. So this kind of like, where is Ralph question is going to come up over and over again. Dr. Shepherd runs into Ackroyd the day of Ferrars' death. They run into each other and he's like, I just saw Ralph. And Ackroyd is like, what? Ralph is in London. And so this is also setting up for us that, like, something weird is happening with Ralph. He's hiding his actions.
Right.
And that also, I think, just plants in Shepherd's mind, like, I can use Ralph's already sketchy actions against him. Okay, I think, too, like, all we need to know is that he runs into this town gossip named Mrs. Gannett, and she says this thing, there's no smoke without fire, about the death and things like that. And I think he's like, again, it's in his mind, he's like, how can I fan these flames? Like, how can I kind of ignite everything and take the blame away from me?
Yeah, and there's this weird thing that happens at the end of the chapter that I actually wanted to ask you about. Miss Russell, correct? She visits Dr. Shepherd in his office about, like, a potential knee situation that she has, like a sore knee or something. And the conversation they have is so bizarre
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't think she's there because her knee hurts, and she's kind of admitting that she's not. And then there's this kind of back and forth about where he's trying to see, like, oh, does Miss Russell want to know about the drug and the like whatever Mrs. Farrar took, and is that why she's there? So he says something about Veronal, the drug that she overdosed on, but Miss Russell doesn't take that bait. And so I guess I don't understand what because that's kind of what ends the chapter. And I don't understand what that was for still.
I think the Mrs. Russell red herring is one of the ones where we could, like, if we took Mrs. Russell away, I think the story would be the same.
Okay. That's what
I think she's kind of one of the only people where I'm like, did we need that? But this is really handy because it helps cast some questions about Mrs. Russell. And it's kind of cool, like, each one of them, they are in separate worlds when they're talking to each other. Each one of them thinks the other one is suspicious of them, but for different reasons. And so I think, can we say why she's there? Can we talk about it now? Okay.
Definitely.
So she's there because she is worried that her long lost son is a drug addict.
Yeah.
She just kind of wants to learn about drug addicts, I guess. She doesn't really get a lot out of him, but she kind of gets there by talking about her knee. And then she uses Mrs. Farrar's as a way to start talking about poison, as a way to start talking about drugs. Right. So that's where she's going, is she's like, how can I naturally ask about drugs? But because she's asking about poison, Dr. Shepard's like, oh my God, she's onto the truth about why Mrs. Farrar's killed herself. I need to watch out for her. And so I think he almost seems a little threatened by her. And we can kind of slow down and look at some of the language here. He also describes her, this is just kind of funny, and this is such a good description. There is a suggestion of cast iron about Mrs. Russell, a something that is above the ills of the flesh. So
yes,
he sees her as kind of a threat. And I think it's because she's a no-nonsense lady.
Right.
He talks about her as stern and forbidding. And he says, if I were a housemaid or a kitchen maid, I should run for my life whenever I heard her coming. So, we're setting her up as someone who's acting weird, and she's kind of scary. And I think this also might be Agatha Christie playing on, I think we've talked about in the past couple books, the women who are a bit masculine or who are a bit foreboding are bad. Kind of, it's bad. You are not feminine. You are not beautiful. You are not sweet. There's something on. And she plays around with it. She catches up on it a little bit and then has beautiful people that are bad. But it just takes a while. And so I think she's also kind of look at this stern woman. She's not fun. She must be up to something. So I think that could be one kind of surface read of it.
Yeah, I think the last paragraph is so interesting because he says, I should never have suspected Miss Russell of a fondness for detective stories. It pleases me very much to think of her stepping out of the housekeeper's room to rebuke a delinquent housemaid and then returning to a comfortable perusal of the mystery of the seventh death or something of that kind. Mystery of the seventh death maybe being a book that doesn't exist. Yeah. But it's such a interesting way for him to compartmentalize at that point in time.
Yeah.
That visit. He seems threatened by her and confused by her, but then at the end, he's talking about finding a way to soften her to kind of fit into his existence. I don't know. It was just a weird thing to end.
It is weird.
Yeah.
Something else, the last thing that's kind of fun in this chapter is she always talks about how Poirot will say this, or in this case it's Shepard. They're in detective stories, the poison is always something rare from South America. They talk about curare. And they're it's so silly because rarely is that actually the case. That's something that happens in a book, this undetectable exotic quote unquote poison. Right. And so then of course, in her later books, I think when she's just let's just have fun with this, I'm just trying to get through writing about Poirot. There is a mystery where somebody is poisoned by curare, and so she like kind of takes this joke that she mentions it a lot, and she's like, okay, now I'll play the joke on myself and on Poirot. So this is the first mention of that, and it comes up again and again and again. Okay, I think we're done with chapter 2. Chapter 3, this again, we are getting soothed here in this chapter, I think. We are getting soothed by the delightfulness that is Poirot. So chapter 3, The Man Who Grew Vegetable Marrows. My subtitle for the chapter is A Lot of Guesses About Strangers.
Right. And I think the thing that I took away from this chapter, it's such a tricky thing to do, but to have the reader know more than the characters do. Yes. Is really interesting. So I just love that about this. Mm-hmm. While in their small garden, Dr. Shepherd is nearly struck by a flying vegetable marrow that was tossed by his somewhat mysterious neighbor. The neighbor apologizes profusely, and they have a genial conversation. The neighbor's last name is Poirot, but we know it's actually Hercule Poirot, who is retired from the world of solving crime and is leading a nondescript, intentionally anonymous existence. After their conversation, Caroline tells Dr. Shepherd that she overheard Ralph Peyton talking to an unidentified woman about losing his inheritance in the very near future. Dr. Shepherd heads to where Ralph is staying in town, a pub with rooms available, to speak with him.
Perfect. Gorgeous. So let's get into all the reasons why Poirot is really cute.
So amazing.
And why this chapter is so fun. And this, I think we talked about this in the pre-read, that like this is kind of like the indulgent chapter where everything is really fun and it's really exciting. And I think that's also a bait and switch too. It's like, look, Poirot's back. You know him already now. Like, isn't this fun? And isn't it funny that we know who he is? We get just charm, 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 charm. Meanwhile, Dr. Shepherd is like, oh, Ralph's in town? Why don't I just go see, A, if he knows what I've done, and B, how about I set up to frame him? Right. And so, yeah, there's so much going on. Caroline and Dr. Shepherd are at lunch kind of just gossiping with each other. And we kind of learned that like Caroline saw Ralph and was like, maybe I'll just follow him into the woods. Right. So she was like, yeah, I took the woods. And Dr. Shepherd is like, no, she hates the woods. She was definitely just like spying on Ralph. She hears them arguing.
Dr. Shepherd lets us know that this is the only area in King's Abbot where you could go to meet with a woman and not be observed. So we're seeing like in links with kind of like the magical shrubbery where all these things, forest. Magical forest. Like this is the equivalent to that.
I think this gives Shepherd the idea that like Ralph is being so sketchy, he can exploit this. That's what I got from it. But then we get these musings about their neighbor, Poirot, as you said. Caroline is really frustrated because they have this new neighbor and she can't find out anything about him. She's like, I've been asking around to all the delivery people and no one will tell me anything. And I think the only thing she's found out is that he owns a vacuum cleaner, which at that time is like very rare. And so she's like, I'm so frustrated. I need to know about him. And also the other thing they know is that he's interested in growing vegetable marrows. And so they're like, who could he be? And they guess that because of his mustache, the only thing that he could be, they're so positive that he is actually a retired hairdresser. Or actually, that's what Shepherd says. And we get Caroline dissented. She said that if the man was a hairdresser, he would have wavy hair, not straight. All hairdressers did. So like cute banter.
So he says, I began to be more interested in our mysterious neighbor, a man who is capable of shutting up Caroline and sending her like the Queen of Sheba empty away. Must be something of a personality. The way that he ends up in the garden is not to meet Poirot, right? It's to get away from Caroline. So it's interesting. Yeah.
We kind of get, and we talked about this before, that like Caroline and Poirot are adversaries, but not seriously. They're both just trying to figure out what's going on. It is like, who's going to get there first, Caroline or Poirot? But it's like they're working together. It's a friendly rivalry.
Yeah.
And it's not even a rivalry. It's kind of more like Caroline's really competitive. And Poirot isn't competitive because he knows he's right. So it's really Caroline running her own race.
Exactly.
And then we get this like adorable introduction to Poirot. We said that like this is the weirdest Poirot because he is causing chaos. And Poirot does not cause chaos. So we can tell that something is very wrong with him. And I think that's what we're supposed to get, is he is trying to like live out this life of retirement that he's romanticized. But like Poirot can't help but be Poirot. He needs a mystery. If he doesn't get a mystery, he starts throwing things.
He was so excited to retire and just lead this calm life. But he does go through some really great descriptions to Dr. Shepard about what it's like to decide that you're going to spend your time growing these vegetable marrows, but then despise them because you no longer are interested because you miss the thing that you thought you were escaping from.
And that leads us to this really interesting like divulgence from Shepard. But let's like linger on our introduction to Poirot. We always have to do it. So this is from Shepard's perspective. He is nearly hit in the head by a vegetable marrow that Poirot is so frustrated with that he throws it over the wall. So again, on Poirot. I looked up angrily. Over the wall to my left, there appeared a face. An egg-shaped head partially covered with suspiciously black hair, 2 immense mustaches, and a pair of watchful eyes. It was our mysterious neighbor, Mr. Poirot. We're comforted. Poirot is here. He is back. You know, Poirot's like really embarrassed. He's like, I'm so sorry. I was just so angry. He says, Monsieur, I'm ashamed. I prostrate myself. Then next they're like talking. They're getting to know each other. Poirot admits like, you know, I tried to retire, but I can't. I used to have this very, very interesting job. And he's like really trying to get Dr. Shepard to ask him what he was. And so Shepard is like, okay, what did you do? What is your very, very interesting job? And he was like, I studied human nature. And he's like, oh, so he definitely was a retired hairdresser. Who knows the secret of human nature better than a hairdresser? And then we get also Poirot then begins, he still doesn't tell him what he does, but he laments the absence of Hastings. He says, you know, I had a friend for many years who never left my side, occasionally of an imbecility. I even miss his stupidity, his naivete, his honest outlook, which I think is interesting.
Interesting, yes.
The pleasure of delighting and surprising him by my superior gifts. Then it's funny because Dr. Shepard is like, oh, he died? Like, he's like, why do you miss your friend so much? He's like, no, he lives in South America. They look at each other and Shepard says he seemed an understanding little man. Shepard hasn't done anything yet, but I just feel like Poirot is like reading him with his little gaze.
It's almost like he can't turn it off.
Yeah.
It might not have anything to do with Dr. Shepard. It just might be that like this is the way that Poirot talks to everybody because he's always just like honed in.
Yeah, he's the cat. He's like looking for his next mouse, kind of.
Yes.
The thing that's also really interesting here is it is this like seduction almost. Agatha Christie's luring us in by saying like, oh, Poirot misses Hastings. Here is this doctor. And Poirot is so delighted by all of the ways that he finds parallels between him, Shepard, and Hastings too. He says, I've made the acquaintance of a man who in some ways resembles my far-off friend. Automatically, in our minds, we're supposed to replace Hastings and Shepard. And so then we're like, we trust him.
Exactly.
We know his role. We're like, oh, that's why it's him. He's going to be his buddy. He's going to be his sidekick. They're going to solve this together. And that actually takes us away from asking why Shepard is following Poirot around and why Shepard is so invested in this mystery anyways. By replacing them, we're like, oh, well, naturally he should be there. When really it's kind of weird.
Right. It's very bizarre. Yes. And we do find out that Poirot, he tells Shepard that he knows Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah, and I think that's when he was like, okay, I'm starting to realize that he wasn't a hairdresser because why would Ackroyd take a hairdresser into his confidence and discuss the marriage of his niece and stepson?
Yeah.
So he's like, okay, I was wrong. But this is really interesting too because, you know, Poirot in his like attempt to like connect with Shepard. He makes that thing about like, oh, I'm trying to retire, but I can't. I had all these plans and I hate them. And Dr. Shepard is like, oh, in this conversation, he says something that seems really innocent, but this sets up Shepard's motivation for everything. And he's lying to Poirot here, but he's also lying to us. He's like, Poirot, I totally get it. I came into a legacy and inherited a large sum of money a year ago. I envisioned like traveling the world and doing all these things with all this money. But look, I'm still here. You and I are the same, which again is like so deceptive because they're not at all. But if we think about it for a second, it's really weird that he inherited a lot of money that his sister doesn't have.
Yes.
That his sister doesn't know about. But we just brush over it. It's like, oh, whatever. And so that's a big hint as to what his connection is with Mrs. Farrows and why he has to murder Ackroyd, which we shall get to. And also another reason why we need to trust Shepard a little bit is that Poirot gifts him his best marrow.
His best marrow.
Uh-huh. Yeah. He's like, I'm so sorry. You seem so nice. Let me gift you my best marrow. And I just don't think he would do that for anyone.
It was a reaching out. It was a marrow branch, if you will. But he also mentions to bring it to his sister. So it's like not just it's for both of them and their domesticated life together. Yes.
Yes. And in this conversation, Poirot reveals that Ralph is actually engaged to Flora. And he says that Ackroyd is really happy about it. That also then builds that story of like, Flora may want that money. Ralph may want that money. People are after Ackroyd's money, and this is a great way to put the blame off of him.
It's also a really smart thing, too, because not that we need to be reminded, but maybe we do because it's been a little while since we've seen Poirot, but the town gossip is that potentially Ackroyd is not thrilled about the engagement. And Poirot knows different. He knows he has the information. There's kind of like okay, so there's a little shift there. Like, okay, so Ackroyd's actually really happy about this. That's great. That's great. I do just want to quickly, because this made me laugh, I had to write it down. I love the way that Poirot criticizes the English people. When he's talking about how Ralph Peyton is good looking, Shepard says, "What made you notice Ralph Peyton, his good looks?" And Poirot goes, "No, not that alone, though he is unusually good looking for an Englishman."
Oh my God, I read over that.
So great.
Burn.
So great.
Okay, and I think we talked about this before. Maybe we talked about it out of order, but that conversation that Caroline overheard in the woods, Ralph says that Ackroyd is about to disinherit him. So like Ralph is definitely sketch. He's in town. He hasn't told his father. He's really worried that his father will change his will. And he even says to the woman, we can't let him change his will because I'm going to get all of his money after he dies.
Right.
So like already like Ralph is setting himself up he's framing himself for the murder. And he doesn't even realize that yet.
Well, he's in the woods. He doesn't think anyone can hear him. So
he's in the magic woods. So it's really interesting because then Dr. Shepard's like, okay, guys, I'm going to go check in on my friend Ralph. And he tells us too, he knows Ralph better than anyone. This is also like so sinister because it sounds like, at least the way he's telling us, kind of like the way he told us about Ackroyd, he is like Ralph's major confidant. Ralph trusts him completely. And so he's going to go like, quote unquote, check in on his friend. But really he's like, how about I set him up? And he even asks, this is so creepy. He says, could I do anything with the boy? I thought I could. And I think when you read that the first time, your head or one's head automatically replaces the with for. Could I do anything for the boy? I thought I could. But no, it's what can I do with him? How can I use him? It's so cruel.
The entire meeting between the two of them is just such on the second read, so eerie. It's just like, oh, you're setting this kid up. This is unbelievable.
Yeah. And so like Shepard goes and visits Ralph, and Ralph is so happy to see him. He says like, Dr. Shepard, you're the one person I'm glad to see. And that just breaks my heart a little bit. And Ralph confesses, he says, I'm in a devil of a mess with Ackroyd. I can't see my way ahead. And so I feel like Shepard is literally like a lion, like circling him at this point. And Ralph is just this like tiny little innocent deer where he's just like, I'm moving around in the world. Everything is so easy for me. And yeah, Shepard's just circling.
The last line, I think, is so interesting, the way that it's just, that's how the chapter ends.
Yeah, and he says, yes, I've got to play a lone hand. And he repeats this over and over again, and that's the last line. Ralph is incriminating himself the past 2 chapters. We are set up to see him as trying to get Ackroyd's money at any cost so that he can marry Flora.
I also wanted to say, did you catch this? Because it took me a little while. What's the name of the pub/room?
Oh, it's the Three Boars?
Which is like a triple pig.
Stop it. No. Oh my God. Agatha, we're not worthy of her.
No. I was like, why is that sticking in my head? And I was like, okay. Wow.
And so, and for listeners who are like, what are you talking about? One of our favorite exclamations that Poirot makes in Styles is triple pig when he's frustrated. He's like, triple pig. And he says this a lot. Like when he's mad, he's like 1,000 thunders or like triple something. Like you are a triple idiot. So That's amazing. So all of this has been set up so far. And then we get a very, just normally named chapter, Dinner at Fernley. But this is where the magic happens. And yeah, I'll just hand it over to you, Chad.
Chapter 4, Dinner at Fernley. Dr. Shepard arrives at Fernley, Roger Ackroyd's estate, for dinner. We meet a bunch of characters. Parker, the butler, Mr. Raymond, Ackroyd's secretary, Flora Ackroyd, Mrs. Ackroyd, Major Blunt, and a stranger. Before dinner, Flora confirms that she and Ralph are engaged. During dinner, Roger Ackroyd is sullen and depressed. After dinner, he insists that Dr. Shepard meet with him alone in the study. After the meeting, Dr. Shepard heads home. On his way, he bumps into a stranger who seems oddly familiar. Once home, he and Caroline call it a night, but there is a phone call. It's Parker, Roger Ackroyd's butler. He says that Roger Ackroyd has been found dead.
Whew. That's exactly what Shepard wants us to think. I hadn't realized, though, on reading this, I love... This is like that satisfaction of the reread. There's this whole thing where he comes in and meets the butler, and the butler's like getting his coat and stuff. And then the butler's like, oh, what do you want me to do with your doctor's bag? And this ends up playing a really big role in the murder. And I had noticed, so like going back to that moment where he sets foot in Ackroyd's house before dinner, he brings his black bag.
Yes.
Which makes me think that I think this is premeditated as an option. Like he hasn't decided to kill him because he doesn't need to.
That's where he puts the dagger.
Yeah, and the dictaphone, right?
Oh, yeah. The dagger, the first, in chapter 4, the dagger, chapter 5, the dictaphone.
So the black bag is really important. And it becomes like one of the final things that makes Poirot realize it's him, is he's like, who could be sneaking things in and out of this room? Someone with a black bag. So, oh my God. So we get, he like literally steps inside and Parker's like, are you here for a professional call? Because he sees the bag. And we get the sentence, the last was an allusion to my black bag, which I had laid down on the oak chest. So he's literally like placing the tool that he will use to get away with this murder in like the first paragraph, basically, of this chapter.
Right.
And he knows and we don't know. And so like just something as little as like this little exchange between them has so much significance, and you would have never known it.
There's the whole thing then, that's brilliant. And there's a whole thing then with him saying that he thinks he hears a window shut in one of the rooms, but then when he goes to see it, he sees that there are French doors in this room, and that it not the sound of a window shutting. So he looks around the room to see what would have made that noise, and he sees he realizes that it was I can't remember exactly what it is.
Silver table.
a silver table, and he realized the sound of that shutting when Miss Russell, the housekeeper, is shuts it, and then he goes, and that's where the dagger is, I believe.
Yeah.
And so what we don't ever know, because we never, until Poirot brings all this up, all of these different things he's doing in the worst case scenario that Roger Ackroyd knows that he blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. So he's preparing himself to murder him at this early in the chapter.
And I didn't even realize this until you said it, because he hears the lid and then he goes to the silver table. Is this the moment? Are you saying this is the moment where he takes the knife? We just don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh my God.
Because I can't think of another time when he would. Yeah.
And he can't make that sound either. So he has to be taking this knife as an insurance policy, basically. There's some character building here, which I don't think we have to linger on, but there's some great what is that called? The magician thing where it's look over here, but I'm actually doing things over here. I don't know what it's called.
Misdirection?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
There's some really good misdirection because immediately after this, we return to the chat. We return to the silver table. We get the introduction of Flora. We get the introduction of all these other people. And Flora is really funny and she has these really smart observations about things. And so we're just completely distracted for a couple pages. It's here's this person, here's this person, here's a funny thing that they said.
We're also given a lovely little twist to Major Blunt perhaps not being a very, very open or good person, and especially looking at it from the lens of today, a big game hunter who's who I would just despise. But nonetheless, he clearly has a soft side for Flora. Dr. Shepard sees him kind of change his body language around her and try to help her with certain things. And so those are all things that distract.
Yeah. And let's pause on Hector Blunt. He's horrible. I mean, I think he's a very typical character of the time, a very typical personality. I think when she talks about him, we're supposed to, as readers of her era, have someone in mind that reminds us of him. Yeah. But he's famous for shooting wild animals. His love story is one of the because, I guess there's always kind of, in the past couple books we've had so far, there's always a couple lovers that are reunited at the end of the story. And that gives it a positive thing. There's always a coupling. And he's one of those people, but he is so unattractive. Shepard says, I was so surprised that he was talking to Flora because he hates women so much.
Yes.
And so I was wow, that makes him even more attractive. It's so funny when, and this happens in books, and I think this happens even now, in romances, when it's clear a guy is in love with a woman because he doesn't hate her.
Right.
And that's his two modes of dealing with women. Yeah. It's the men who are I love women because I have a daughter and a wife. It's you can still hate women.
Oh, yes.
And you can still be really shitty to women. Just because you're attracted to one doesn't change anything.
No, exactly. And it's also, then it's always the onus is put on the woman to be hey, you're the one he doesn't hate, so you better get with him. Yeah. Right? It's this weird thing. Why would you get with someone who hates the rest of, the women, right? Yeah, it's crazy.
It's don't you feel so special being chosen by this shitty guy who beheads animals all the time?
Yeah, who murders animals. Yeah,
exactly. And I think... I guess we're also set up, I never really saw him as a suspect, but he comes and goes every 2 years. He stays for a while. He's clearly an animal murderer. So maybe he's murdering his friend too. We kind of get him as a possible suspect, but it's never really serious. We get this awkward dinner too. Blunt is staring out into the distance. Ackroyd is really upset. Flora's worried about Ackroyd. And so it sounds like Shepard and Raymond, who is Ackroyd's secretary, are keeping the conversation going, and everybody else is just acting really weird. And so then right after the meal, Ackroyd is Shepard, we have to talk. And so you can see how he's he knows. And then this is so smart. Ackroyd doesn't want Parker to think that anything is wrong. And like, he doesn't really want to show why Shepard is there. So he makes up this excuse about like, oh, you know, do you have any more like stomach pills? I'm not feeling that great. And so Shepard is like, Parker, could you bring me my doctor's bag? And Parker does, and it's totally normal because he has this like excuse of being in medicine and like offering this comfort to Ackroyd. Then Ackroyd kind of confesses his worries. He's just like, Mrs. Ferrars was really upset about something. She was going to tell me everything. Ackroyd tells Shepard that he knows Mrs. Ferrars killed her husband, and that she confessed that to him. And then she said, give me 24 hours and I'll tell you the rest. And then in between then, that's when she kills herself. And Ackroyd is like, I think she is in some way going to tell me who the blackmailer was. He was like, and I have this feeling that she wants me to do something about it.
Then Parker comes in with the papers and the mail.
Yeah, Parker comes in with the Evening Post, like just like on time. So then, of course, there's this letter and Mrs. Ferrars' handwriting. Shepard is like, hey, why don't you read it out loud? He's like, hey, why don't you tell me? So he's like really pushy. You can see it as him wanting to help his friend, which is also so sinister. Like, he's like, no, just get it out now. Like, kind of like, let me be here for you. I want to be here with you in the room. You should do it now.
I can help you take this person to task, even, right?
Ugh. Yeah. Ackroyd is like, look, dude, I'm going to read this by myself. Like, I need to process this on my own. And Dr. Shepard is like, I need to be in the room with this man when he finds out this information, or prevent him from finding out this information. I need to be here for damage control. We get Dr. Shepard, no, I cried impulsively, read it now. And then we get this. This is when we have this like beautiful, elegant moment of omission where the whole murder happens, but it's redacted and we just skip around. Yep. So he's like pushing him to like, read the letter. And Shepard says, for some reason, obscure to myself, I continued to urge him. And then we get, and this is Ackroyd's last moment, now Ackroyd is essentially pig-headed. The more you urge him to do a thing, the more determined he is not to do it. All my arguments were in vain. Pause. Between this sentence and the next one, the murder happens. It's covered up. The next sentence, just to have it make sense, is the letter had been brought in at 20 minutes to 9. It was just on 10 minutes to 9 when I left him, the letter still unread. So we're to assume that they were arguing, and then Shepard just kind of leaves because he gives up. But no, like in between that paragraph break, this whole murder happens. And then this part is just so creepy. He says, I hesitated with my hand on the door handle, looking back and wondering if there was anything left undone. I could think of nothing. With a shake of the head, I passed out and closed the door behind me. This doesn't read as weird. You know, we can just kind of forgive it. But there's something so ominous about, I wondered if there was anything I had left undone. Ugh.
I would go as far to say that whole thing becomes very obvious the way it's worded without the softening up of Dr. Shepard, the comparisons to Hastings, the concept that he's the narrator. All of those things let her get away with that. Mm-hmm. When I got to that part on the reread, I had chills. Mm-hmm. I was like, I totally missed this.
Yeah.
I totally missed, even when the reveal happened the first time that I read it, I didn't put together the exact moment.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy shit, this is incredible.
It's so creepy. And I think it is unsettling, like as a reader, to be like, oh my God, I was so fooled. How cool is that?
Yeah, it's
like,
amazing.
How clever. And yeah, it's like going back, you're like, that is such a weird thing to say. But he's using just like the power of narration too. Like when we read a story, time skips forward and we don't think about it. We're like, nothing important happened there. We trust you. Then we kind of get like, oh, Parker is suspicious because he was listening at the door. And so that kind of gives us like, oh, is Parker up to something? And again, it's creepy because like the way Shepard is acting is not normal. You know, he says to Parker, Mr. Ackroyd particularly does not want to be disturbed. I said coldly. So, you know, like, right. He's kind of being a jerk. He's like emotionless. He's like stone.
When he gets back home, what happens. It's so freaky.
Well, and let's even slow down and talk about like what he's doing with the boots and how he does it.
Oh, yeah.
Because like
sure.
it's brilliant because he makes it look like a locked door mystery. So what he does is he opens one of the French doors, leaves that ajar for himself. He goes and gets Ralph's boots, walks around in them, like walks in mud, like inside the office and then outside to make it look as if Ralph entered and left and killed Ackroyd. And so, yeah, he does all of that and then goes home. And he's just like left all of that out. And so, and he locks the door from the inside too. And so that kind of, it pins it on Ralph. It makes it seem even more so that he had nothing to do with it because the door was locked from the inside. So that's how he creates this mystery. On the way home, he runs into this guy who sounds like he's a foreigner, rough and uneducated. And he says that the voice is familiar. We know now, having read this 1,000 times, that this is Mrs. Russell's son.
Drug addict.
The drug addict. Or the potential drug addict. And so he's on his way to meet his mom. But he's also just another like mystery kind of red herring. Like, who is this mysterious man? And like things start really falling into Dr. Shepard's lap, which we'll see in the next chapter. Like there are a ton of weird things that he had no control over that like take the suspicion away from him in several different ways. So this is like really good luck for him. He's very lucky at this point. This is a very weird thing too. He lies to Caroline, and again, we're like used to it by now. We've been like kind of trained to expect him to lie, to like be private and not have Caroline know everything. He says, I had to make up a slightly fictitious account of the evening in order to satisfy her. I had an uneasy feeling that she saw through the transparent device. And this is because he arrived earlier than he normally would, like going out to dinner with friends. Ugh.
Yeah. And then we get the phone call. And it's Dr. Shepard hears the phone, walks back down the stairs because he was on his way to bed, and picks it up and says, it's Parker, Roger Ackroyd's butler. They found Roger Ackroyd dead, which then means that he is leaving the house to go back to Fernley, which we will get into in chapter 5, again, talking about it from both the first read and the second read perspectives, because what happens in chapter 5 is just it's so crazy because it just keeps building and happening throughout the book. Like all of these things that you are like, oh yeah. That's what that is now. Oh my God.
Yeah. Oh, it was that. Oh, I should have seen that. Oh. And again, she's like, it's everywhere. The murder is everywhere. The truth is everywhere. We just don't have all the information to see it. Two things about this before we move on. I kind of noticed that faked phone call, he's acting for Caroline, but he's also acting for us, which is so amazing. He's like doing this big show. Yeah. This like play kind of. And so it's interesting that he's doing that too in that moment. And then something just kind of nice is like, you know, we have the telephone. They've just found Roger Ackroyd murdered. This to me feels like a callback to Lynx when they find out that like another body has been found and then the chapter ends. I feel like that just becomes something kind of like a classic Agatha Christie thing, is like, so-and-so's been murdered.
Right. Very much so. And then I think it also shows what we find out at the beginning of the next chapter, where to the reader, you feel like, okay, you're going back to Fernley now. And in chapter 5, Parker's going to rush Dr. Shepard up the stairs to help, you know, with the body and stuff. But that's not what happens. So
yeah, there's like another plot twist
that allows for all of the things that come to make much more sense.
I love it. Just like Agatha Christie, we're going to end on this surprising note and give everyone a chance to digest, process, and think about all the things we've set up. And then we'll pick back up with murder, chapter 5, murder, next time.
Wow.
This is exciting. We had talked about, this book is like kind of breezier, and it is, but there's still just so much to unpack with it too. But it's like really enjoyable.
The other books have been trying to figure out, even though they're not necessarily linear plot lines, but you're trying to solve a mystery. This one, you're completely and totally fooled. And when you come back to it, you're astonished. which is just a whole different dynamic.
It's fun to like go through that astonishment together and with everyone.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So we will pick back up at the scene of the crime.
Most definitely.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.